Hey guys, welcome to podcast 3 of The Balanced Lensed, where we talk about faith, culture, and politics from a Christian worldview. You're joined by me, Dennis, by Tijo and Biju to have an intellectual discussion about something that's been relevant in the news. It's been the 2-year anniversary of October 7th, the horrific terror attack on Israel by the militant group Hamas. This would become the deadliest terror attack in Israeli history, where Hamas launched thousands of rockets into Israel from Gaza. Hamas soldiers also crossed into the Gaza border into Israel, where they killed nearly 1,200 people and kidnapped 200 more, many of them civilians. Dozens of reported cases of sexual assault and rape also occurred. This attack has been called Israel's 9/11. Hamas has justified their attack by citing Israel's occupation of the Palestinian territories and what it calls atrocities against the Palestinian people. So to get some history on this, and there's a lot of history here, we're going to play a couple clips here so we can really understand what's going on behind the scenes. First clip is interesting. It's from Hillary Clinton, who went on The View and actually explained her position and essentially the history of relationships between the Palestinian Authority and the U.S.
Well, I think that the problem predates October 7th. And I think that's what President Obama was talking about, because let's remember, this is a very long and complicated history.
Yeah.
My husband, with the Israeli government at the time in 2000, offered a Palestinian state to the Palestinians, at that time run by Arafat, Yasser Arafat.
The PLO.
And the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which, by the way, took out of its charter violence against Israel. So you got to separate the Palestinians who believe that there is some future of peace with Hamas, which believes it has to destroy Israel. Yeah, those are two different organizations, and they have to be viewed in that way. Arafat turned that down. There would have been a Palestinian state now for 23 years if he had not walked away from it. There was another attempt when I was Secretary of State to try to, bring the Palestinians and the Israelis together. That didn't work out. Israel left Gaza in 2005 and forcibly ejected 50,000 Israelis who were living in Gaza. They left all of their infrastructure. They had a big infrastructure of greenhouses where they were supplying fruits, vegetables, flowers, etc. And the Palestinians deserved to have a productive, successful economy in Gaza. Hamas came in and basically destroyed all of that and killed a lot of other Palestinians. So I think when President Obama says that, it requires us to look at the history. And of course, history holds all of us accountable.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And that is a fair statement. But today we have to look at where we are. And I believe it's imperative, since we have had numerous ceasefires with Hamas, all of which they have violated, to try finally to dislodge Hamas and allow the Palestinians to have other leadership that will actually once again work for a two-state solution, which should be the outcome that we all hope and pray for.
So obviously interesting take there. Former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, former presidential candidate as well. Plenty of experience there in the White House. We're going to see another clip, this one by former President Clinton, her husband, who talks a bit more about how he really dealt with the Palestinian Authority and some of their previous peace deals.
Look, I think what's happened there in the last 25 years is one of the great tragedies of the 21st century. And when I tell the young people, for example, who are understandably in America, let's say they're super sympathetic with the Palestinians. Well, they've been killed. A lot of those Palestinians have, and all they know is a lot more Palestinians have been killed than Israelis. And I tell them what Arafat walked away from. And they can't believe it. I said, oh yeah, he walked away from a Palestinian state with a capital in East Jerusalem, 96% of the West Bank, 4% of Israel, to make up for the 4% that the settlers occupy that were beyond the borders in the 67 war. And I go through all the stuff that was in the deal, and they like, it's not on their radar screen. They can't even imagine if that happened. And I tell them, you know, the first and most famous victim of an attempt to give the Palestinians a state was Prime Minister Rabin, whom I think loved as much as I ever loved another man. And so Rabin, he dies, and then Shimon Peres is defeated in the election, and the rest of it is history. But you walk away from these once in a lifetime peace opportunities, and you can't complain 25 years later when the doors weren't all still open and all the possibilities weren't still there. You can't do it. It's just,
your voice just cracked when you said that.
Sissy, pretty fascinating insight into, how close they were to achieving peace. Now to present, the opinion from the other side of this, from a Palestinian voice. I think it's fair to share how they see this whole conflict and what they really think about what Israel is doing and their perception of things. So,
what is it like for the ordinary Palestinian before October 7th?
So basically, I know that they've been used a lot like an open air concentration camp or prison. 2 million people lived in the most concentrated, more dense area in the world, and you have no rights. You have no right to travel. Everything has to go through another authority that controls your food, your electricity, your water. Some parts of Gaza, you're only on 2 hours a day to get water. If you're living in the West Bank, your land is being taken away from you, being eaten into your land every day. Your house could be just like settlers can go and take your land and kick you out. To go through like a 1 kilometer distance, you have to go through like 7 or 8 checkpoints. As we speak right now, there's 2 units in Hebron, and this is something called Yehuda Shoal, who's the founder of Breaking the Silence. He's an ex-IDF soldier. So like as we speak right now, there's 2 units on an 8-hour shift in Hebron that their only mission is to maintain the presence or make their presence felt, which they can go into your house, a house that intelligence tells you that there's no threat, goes in, separate men and women, ruffle the feather, go ruffle everything, break everything, go from house to house. This is like the daily life of Palestinians. They have no humanity, they have no rights. Even if you are in the West Bank, I'm not even talking about Gaza, you are not allowed as a Palestinian to have any fertile land in Area C, which is all of the fertile land. You as a Palestinian, your water share is 1/5 or 1/6 of a settler. You're not allowed to dig for wells. You're not allowed to dig for water. You're not allowed to actually, even if you, it's a very inhumane way, and it's been going like this for 75 years, and nobody's doing anything about it. So at at a certain point, you as a Palestinian, you can at a certain IDF soldier can come and take you, put you in prison, put you on administrative detention for months and even years. There's some that have been in jail for 10, 15 years with absolutely no accusation. Israel is the only country in the world that tries children in front of a military court with 99.7% conviction rate. There's nothing that never happens anywhere. So that is even, I didn't even scratch the surface. And when you do that on daily basis for 75 years, at a certain point people will crack, and people will throw rocks. If you throw rocks, you're a child, your limbs are broken. If you are a Palestinian and you take a dagger and want to fight back, you will be of course killed, and you'll be labeled as a terrorist.
so really interesting here. We have another perspective from someone who's not Israeli, someone not on the American right. One last video here we're going to share, really giving us insight. Again, this is Bill Clinton, who spent so much of his time in diplomatic relations, trying to negotiate with the Palestinian Authority. Here he's going to talk about the strategy that Hamas employs and what they use. So check this out. Here he's addressing a question in his audience.
Depends on whether you care what happens to the Palestinians as opposed to the Hamas government and the people with guided missiles. Yes, they were. Yes, they were. Now, wait a minute. Yes, they were. And Hamas is really smart. When they decide to rocket Israel, they insinuate themselves in the hospitals, in the schools, in the highly populous areas, and they are smart. So they try. So they wait. They try to put the Israelis in a position of either not defending themselves or killing innocents. They're good at it. They're smart. They've been doing this a long time. Look, I don't agree. I killed myself to give the Palestinians a state. I had a deal they turned down that would have given them all of Gaza. All of Gaza between 96 and 97% of the West Bank, compensating land in Israel.
So again, there you hear former President Clinton talking about Hamas's strategy in the war, what they do to essentially gain international support. And last but not least, I want to share a map of the Middle East in case no one has ever seen what the Middle East actually looks like. I think that's important to understand the region of the world we're talking about. You see that tiny little country, Israel, by the Mediterranean Sea. Essentially, you see the Arab world that surrounds Israel. So that's the context of the discussion that we're going to be referencing for today. And so, as you can see, there's a long history in the region. We start with the Ottoman Empire, the end of World War I, go through the Balfour Declaration, the British Mandate. We're going to have a multi-episode series on this. This is not fit for a 20, 30-minute podcast. We're going to talk through the UN partition plan, the formation of Israel, what was Nakba. People often talk about Nakba. It was really, displacement from a war that was happening. We'll talk through the 1967 war, 1973, Jatadas, Oslo Accords, finally October 7, 2023. The question to be asked is this. Given all the facts we just heard, who is on the right side of the conflict?
All right. So
Go ahead, Vijay.
a seemingly simple question, right? Based on all the discussions we had and what we know to have happened on October 7th. Who's in the right and who's on the wrong? I think the answer to this question requires a little more nuanced approach. So I'd like to start by summarizing some of the relevant legal standards we should be considering when we talk about this. Number one, there's something called the International Humanitarian Law, and it governs conduct during armed conflict. The core principles covered in this law, one is distinction between combatants and civilians. Two, proportionality. It has to be proportional. And three, there has to be precautions to protect civilians. So any deliberate attacks on civilians are war crimes. And collective punishment is also unlawful. So that's the first law, the International Humanitarian Law. The second one is the International Human Rights Law. And that applies mostly to peacetime, but also overlaps in conflict. So it dictates the protection of life, movement, and access to humanitarian aid. And the last standard that we will be referencing is the right to self-defense. So under the UN Charter, states do have a right to defend its citizens against armed attacks. But self-defense must comply with the laws I mentioned earlier. So when I use this criteria to answer this question, number one, I would say that Hamas's intentional targeting of civilians on October 7th is unquestionably wrong and illegal. They also consistently hide military assets among their civilians and use tunnels in populated areas. Both tactics contribute to civilian risk. Israel, on the other hand, had every right to self-defense. However, I will note that there is intense debate if Israel is being consistently compliant with the international laws, given the mass destruction of infrastructure in Gaza and the mass displacement of the civilian population. As we consider that, I also want to just have a quick data point. Out of the 2.1 million population in Gaza, 65,000 plus people have been killed so far, which is like 3% of the population. And the vast majority are civilians, mostly women and children. So that's just to give context on the casualties of war, the extreme casualties of war. The last point I want to leave with is, even though the specific conflict began in October 7th, just as we heard Hillary talk about, we have to place this within the historical perspective that we know. And we are going to cover it later, but there are structural causes, whether they are perceived or real, like occupation, as it's called, statelessness, security fears, refugee problem. All these complexities need to be considered in order to talk about lasting peace. To do so, both sides will have to learn how to trust each other and come up with a political resolution that is based on accountability and humanitarian protection. So that's my view on it.
I know we're called the balanced lens, but my response is not going to be balanced at all. I want to talk about this taking a step back. What's the history between Israel and Hamas? Where does that start? You got to go all the way back to 1700 BC, before Christ. We're going all the way back in history. The deed for where Israel sits today is recorded in Genesis 23 by Abraham when he purchased the properties. That area is the Israelites. Abraham purchased that. Actually, you could go even further and say in I think it's Second Samuel, the deed for where the Temple Mount sits was recorded by David when he purchased it. So if you go back to 1700 BC, further back to 1000 BC, you see that both properties that are under Israeli control today were purchased and recorded. And then you have to go back to, where did the name Palestine even come from? In 63 BC, the Romans gave that land the name Palestine as a mockery to the Jews after they broke a rebellion that the Jews had. And then you go even, you come closer to the future in the 1500s when the Ottoman Empire was around, they started calling that area by the name of Palestine that we know today. That area was then controlled by in 1918 after World War I by the British, right? In 1923, the Balfour Declaration gave that land, gave Israel new life in that land. There was a realization that Jews were dispersed, the Arabs had their area, and the Jews did not have a homeland. So that's where the whole Zionist movement started, the fact that they didn't have a place to call their own. And then, of course, you had World War II happen, which saw the genocide of 6 million Jews, which is an actual genocide where they systematically went in and tried to eliminate that race from the face of the earth. And in 1948, when Israel was formed, Britain proposed a two-state solution. Israel would get 51% of that land that was currently occupied, and there would be an Arab nation to control, to lead that area. You would create Palestine, 48%. They rejected that deal. Also, as part of that deal, they realized that Jerusalem is a highly volatile area and that would have a special status that's open to everyone. It would be under international control. They rejected that deal. That is literally the best deal that you could have possibly happened, an ideal two-state solution. What happened the day the British left? You had Egypt, Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Iraq. Dennis showed that the map where you could see all the different regions laid out. The day the Britain withdrew, all 5 of those nations attacked Israel. It is a miracle that Israel is still here today as a country. Actually, there's actually many books and documentaries written about how Israel actually survived. And then Dennis mentioned a lot of different peace deals and offerings for two-state solutions declared. And actually, a lot of the Arab nation point towards 1949, when Israel expelled 700,000 Palestinians. They didn't actually expel 700,000 Palestinians. Half of them chose to leave given the conflict and the fact that they hated the Israeli people. Now, this land that Israel occupied in 1949, it was a desert. There's nothing there. Nothing grows there. No one wanted it. The fact that it even came up for a Jewish nation, and the reason why people were even willing to talk about it was because that land was barren. They were willing to give that to the Jews because no one wanted it. The Jews brought in a lot of agriculture. Israel has advanced salinization technology beyond human comprehension. They literally take seawater, turn it into water, funnel it into the desert, and create life out of the desert. Also, you see, because reforestation happened, you see rain coming back to that area. All of this was actually, I'll get to that, okay? In 1964, with the Palestinian Liberation Organization being formed, these Arab countries decided to come together and try to beat up Israel again. In 1967, there was a 6-day war. Egypt, Syria, and Jordan all attacked Israel preemptively. Israel then captured Sinai, Gaza Strip, West Bank, Jerusalem, Golan Heights. They got more land than they originally signed up as part of the two-state solution. They got all the two-state and then some. Okay, so this brings up to modern day. In 1973, in the Yom Kippur War, which Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel on their holy day, Israel pushed them back and had enormous casualties. And in that peace deal, they returned back, I think it was 1978, they returned back a lot of the land that they got. Israel has proven time and time again, they will give up property, they will give up land to establish peace. But in this region, there is no desire for peace without an offer where Israel is no longer on the face of the planet. To say a population cannot exist to have peace is not peace. By definition, that is like immoral. We cannot support it. 1987, Hamas was formed as an offshoot of the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood. I'm sorry, not the Islamic Brotherhood, the Muslim Brotherhood. And then there's a lot of history back and forth. In 2005, Israel withdrew all of its settlers, all of the people that were its troops from Gaza, and they left all their infrastructure in place. All this desalination, all of the greenhouses, farmland, all of that was left in place in 2005 when they pulled out of that area. Hamas came to power by the people of Palestine electing them to come into power because of their militant wing, right? And, I don't agree with Bill Clinton on a lot of things, but I absolutely agree with him about his statement. In your lifetime, you only have maybe one or two chances to make a major decision. And the fact that Palestine chose to elect a militant group that in their declaration of formation, they said they want to wipe Israel off the face of the planet. Even then, Israel had, I think, something like 20,000 or 50,000 visa holders in Gaza where they were welcome to come into Israel, hold jobs where they could get 10 times the amount of pay and go back and use that money to build their infrastructure. No other country where there's a major conflict allows this to happen, where the opposite side is welcome to come into your country to hold jobs, be part of society, and take that wealth back to the country you're fighting with to then populate that area. And then I want to go even further into the question. What makes October 7th such a blind spot to Israel? Why was Hamas actually successful in attacking Israel during that time? And this goes to the root of who's right and wrong. Hamas chose to attack on October 7th, which is the last day of Shabbat, which is basically, Shabbat is like the remembrance of the 40-day wandering in the desert, right? It was also Saturday, which was their religious holiday. So it's essentially you're having Easter and Christmas on the same exact day. A lot of the Palestinian forces were, a lot of the Israeli forces were not in active duty. Even further than that, there was a festival going on that was internationally known, and Israel's intelligence said that no one would attack during this time because it would be international suicide. You have all these people from different countries coming. We should be okay until this festival is done. So in their intelligence report, they call out the fact that, hey, there's this peaceful music festival going on. It should be a low risk scenario. And then this is what puts a cherry on top for me between the question of who's right or wrong. Hamas, for over a year, more than over a year before October 7th, projected themselves to have civilian cooperation in terms of peace. They made it look like they were much more willing to have peace in that area. They were more interested in ruling that area than they were to take out Israel. They were coming to the table to have conversations. There was no rocket attacks for weeks before that. They allowed 17,000 Gaza folks from Gaza to come in to work with Israel. There was no rocket fire communication at the international realm. Was all about economic peace and pastime. And that's when they also, in that year and leading up from 2007, they trained thousands of fighters to attack, to rape, to mutilate, specifically go into civilian neighborhoods and take hostages. When Israel attacked Gaza and found out their battle plans, their battle strategy was 24 hours, that's it. 24 hours, you get in, you do as much chaos, you record the whole thing, and you come back. So then you have to ask yourself the question, why? You have to ask yourself the question, why did Hamas attack? You saw it in that video. The guy said it's 2 million people in a very small population that, it's a prison, right? Why attack? Why did Hamas attack in such a way where it's a short attack, you record everything, and then you put it on the internet? What was the point of it? Hamas has this long campaign of deception. Their ultimate goal with the attack was to shock the international community. They were hoping that these old friends that they had with Egypt and Lebanon, Syria, all these different areas to come and help them in the attack. Very attack itself was propaganda. They wanted international support and to wipe off Israel from the face of the map. Hamas's leader, I think his name is Sinwar, he is quoted multiple times saying, if Gaza is destroyed, the world will rebuild it, but Israel will never be the same. It was a sacrificial attack. They knew Israel would launch a full-scale attack against Gaza. They knew there would be human casualties, catastrophic human casualties, because they were operating out of hospitals and mosques and schools. They knew what they were doing. They were very intentional about it. They wanted a propaganda war out of this. And because of that, they attacked in such a horrific way to basically poke a bear so that they could claim Israel's killing thousands of Palestinians. Meanwhile, it was Hamas themselves that orchestrated all this effort. And I would go even further, and I would say, that how did Hamas get so much intel on residential neighborhoods miles away from the Gaza Strip? You have to ask yourself, where did this intel come from? They do not have sophisticated technology like Israel does. They do not have ground penetration sonar devices, right? Where they could look at hidden military camps and neighborhoods, right? It was the Palestinian. There are reports that it was the Palestinian people that came into Israel to work that gave Hamas this intel about where are all the locations. I'm not saying they weren't forced to give that intel, but without cooperation from the Palestinian people, Hamas would not get the intel they did to launch an attack at the scale and ferocity that they did. So if you ask me who is in the right between Hamas and Israel in this war, hands down, you have to go with Israel. All the facts and all the data, if you remove the propaganda away, if you remove the bend of social media and the liberal media news outlets away, and you look at the straight facts, Israel is just defending themselves. It's either they defend themselves or they just lay down and die. I'm not defending every action that the Israeli soldiers did. I'm not defending every action that Israel has done. What I'm saying is, you poked a bear knowing that the bear would attack just to get sympathy for your cause, and you got burned.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, the intricacy of how the propaganda war was fueled from all this. If you ask me the question, who's on the right side of the conflict, I'll answer that with a question. Where would you rather live? Where would you raise a family? Where do women, where do the LGBT community, where do Arab Muslims actually have rights? I'll say it clearly, Hamas is a terror organization. Israel is an imperfect but thriving, multicultural, multi-faith democracy. Now, many people ask this question, do Jews belong in the Middle East? They're occupiers. They don't deserve to be there, right? They're taking over this territory. But there were Jews living in the Ottoman Empire. There were Jews living in the area in 1917. Just like every ethnic group had the right to self-determination, the Turks, the Iraqis, the Saudis, the Jordanians, Jews deserve the right to self-determination. They're not occupiers. They've been there for a long time. Israel's land area, look at a map, it's 1%, less than 1% of the total area of all Arab countries combined. My opinion, they deserve more land. But yet this tiny piece of land has been in constant war from nearly every neighbor for the last 75 years because other nations wanted a tiny piece of this 1%. Now, many people ask this question, well, does Israel hate Muslims or Arabs? Again, Israel is a thriving, multicultural, multi-faith democracy. You may not know this, but Israel's population, 18.1% of the population is actually Arab Muslim, right? They enjoy living in Israel, 1.7 million people. The Muslim community is the largest minority in Israel, with a significant portion being Sunnis. There are very notable Arab Muslims serving in Israel's government. Israel's Supreme Court, they have a first permanent Muslim member, Khalid Kaboub. Look it up. He's an Arab judge. There are many Arab judges that serve at various levels in the judiciary, but they even have an Arab judge who's a permanent member of Israel's Supreme Court. Now, people also ask this question, has Israel administered the Gaza and West Bank perfectly. There were 21 Israeli settlements in Gaza before 2005, currently 160 settlements in the West Bank. My opinion, Israel needs to control the flow of settlers into the West Bank and rein in their far right. People may disagree with me on that, but I think some of that has fueled this tension. But another question people ask, given the West Bank and how it's managed, is Israel creating a system of apartheid in the West Bank? And you see plenty of videos on that. There was a 60-minute documentary on that. Let me explain the West Bank here. It's not easy. It's governance is divided between A districts, B districts, and C districts. If you read about it, you're going to be confused. A districts are primarily under Palestinian Authority. C districts are primarily Israeli. B is a mix, and it's not that clear cut. It's very complicated. People say within the West Bank there are checkpoints everywhere that make life horrible. Well, here's why. If you have an Israeli settlement with Palestinian drivers driving into the settlement, there is a possibility of terror. There's a possibility of a bomb exploding. You have checkpoints, rightly so, to guard Israeli settlements, which are not favorable in the area. My opinion, though, I still think you need more infrastructure and political reform in the West Bank. I think it's not administered well. It's very complicated. You look at a map and you look at the Israeli settlements and Palestinian settlements, it's like, a 3-year-old just like throwing paint on a map. It just blobs everywhere. So not simple. Thing people ask about Israel. What about all the detention centers in the West Bank? You can look this up. There are administrative detention centers. Many people call these open air prisons. If you're sent to an administrative detention center, it's usually for provoking the military. Now, people will say, oh, well, there's kids in the administrative detention centers. You can look up the stats. There are no kids under the age of 16 as of December 2024. There are 316 to 18-year-olds. Again, if you don't swing an AK-47 IDF soldier, you likely won't end up there. In that culture, there's not a differentiation between childhood and adulthood like we have in the West at the age of 18. Sadly, kids are taught to threaten soldiers and the military on the front lines. And so you have these detention centers that are set up, regarding Israel and Gaza, right? Well, people ask, well, didn't Israel destroy Gaza? And that's why Hamas started a war. I don't know if you knew this, but Israel fully withdrew from Gaza in 2005, like you guys mentioned. When they withdrew, there was an election. More moderate than Hamas was rejected. Hamas was elected into power in 2006, 2007. Israel has not governed the area since 2005. Now, what are Hamas's goals? I think that's an important part of the discussion. Hamas does have charters and covenants. It doesn't take rocket science to read this. 1988 charter, the Hamas covenant, which they have not rescinded, quote unquote, in the first paragraph. Now, when I read this, I thought, man, I'm going to spend 3 hours trying to figure out like 100 pages. It's in the first paragraph. Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. Reading that verbatim, it's in the first paragraph of the 1988 covenant, which they never rescinded. Article 7 of that covenant, the day of judgment will not come about until Muslims fight the Jews, killing the Jews. Again, not rescinded. What they did do in 2017, they made a revision for political acceptance. Many experts believe this was not a genuine revision to change their position, but merely to gain approval from neighboring Arab nations. However, the 2017 covenant still explicitly states that they do not recognize Israel's legitimacy. They do distinguish between Jews and Zionists, stating that it's a conflict. They do say in Article 18, the establishment of Israel is entirely illegal and contravenes the inalienable rights of the Palestinian people. Again, they never rescinded what they wrote in the charter in 1988, simply modified that charter for political reasons. For these above reasons, Israel instituted an ongoing blockade, severely limiting the movement of people and land by air and sea, which is essential to prevent Hamas from arming itself. Now, you look at Hamas governing Gaza, the question is asked, has Hamas helped the economy of Gaza since taking over? Gaza has been one of the world's top recipients of aid per capita for years, $2 to $4 billion every year. Instead of capital improvements, they've used the money to fund the infrastructure for a very vast terror network. Unemployment for Gaza before October 2023 was 45%. Hamas taken this money, they've radicalized generations of kids via UN money, UN managed money. Now, you look at the culture of Hamas. What's it like? Hamas has created a culture of terror and barbarianism. We talked about October 7th. Barbarians from Hamas took Jewish women, tied them to trees, locked their mouths. They were raped and tortured, one of many atrocities they committed before they were executed and burned alive. Because of this radicalized culture that begins in their schools, Arab countries like Jordan, Turkey, Qatar, Algeria, Kuwait, Egypt. They refuse to take refugees in Gaza. Look at the border between Egypt and Israel. It's a huge fence. It's a bigly wall, as Trump would say. It's gigantic. It's barbed wired. It keeps people from Gaza out of Egypt. Finally, people talk about the questions of the casualties in the war, right? They say Israel's committing genocide. We talked about this before. In any war, innocent life is sadly taken. But when Hamas is firing from hospitals, from residential areas, they are engaging in a propaganda strategy to maximize civilian deaths. Of the 65,000 civilians, people that have been killed, 20,000 or so have been Hamas fighters themselves. The IDF takes precautions to move civilians out of areas where they attack. Just recently in Gaza City, they moved 800,000 civilians out of Gaza City, while Hamas has been setting up roadblocks to prevent them from escaping. So you ask me, what is right and what is wrong? The facts are there. Now, you can continue to debate those facts, but I can show you 3 or 4 references for each one of those facts. And I think it's up to the reader to make the decision. Ultimately, where would you rather live, in Gaza or Israel? And so, complicated question, but I think there's so many dimensions to this. Any thoughts on something we mentioned?
You guys keep saying that, but I don't see the multi-dimension. It's very cut and dry. But like if you go back to who are the Palestinians' friends, right? Like who do the Palestinian people call their friends, right? Jordan in 1970 on a day called Black September expelled thousands or killed thousands of Palestinians after the Palestinian people tried to overthrow the monarch of Jordan. In Lebanon, Palestinians are barred from 30 plus professions, denied citizenship. They've been confined to camps since 1948. Since 1948, they've been confined to camps. Also, there was a war in the 1980s, I think, called the War of Camps. Kuwait in 1991, when the Palestinians supported Saddam Hussein taking over Kuwait, expelled 300,000 Palestinians. Syria, right? One of their best friends, Syria, they besieged and bombarded Palestinians that were taking refuge there and then later expelled. Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states, they're not allowed citizenship. They're not allowed to own property there. The Palestinian people have no rights in that area along the general first and second world countries. So you have to ask yourself, who exactly are the Palestinians' friends? Who's actually doing good for them? And Dennis, I know you brought up this idea that the two areas between Palestine and Israel are similar, and I know you brought up similar comments, and it's like if you look at the two camps, they're economically in very different situations. Do you know Israel has not accepted economic aid since 2007? They accepted it after their creation, but since 2007, $0 have gone to Israel for their economic aid. In the same time, do you know how much money Hamas has gotten since 2007? Estimates go as high as $44 billion. Where's all this money going? What are they doing with it? I'm sure folks watching this will say, like, no. The U.S. gives Israel tons of aid, billions of dollars of aid every year. The U.S. provides military aid to Israel. And you might think, like, well, that's not fair. Why don't they provide military aid to Palestine? I'm coming off very bash, and this is just a very sensitive topic because it's very one-sided for me. But Israel literally turns around, uses that military aid. I think it's like $44 billion since their inception in 1948 to now, how much money we've given them. They take that money, turn around and buy U.S. defense weapons from us. They also invest that money into U.S. businesses as well as Israeli businesses that we have benefited from. So if you look at the two sides, they've generally gotten the same amount of money. But Palestine and Hamas have chosen to use that money not to build their economy, not to invest in the future of their kids, but to destroy Israel. Israel has used that money as self-defense and building their country up to the point where it's one of the superpowers in the world. And then I would go even further. Do you know how much aid Israel actually does for Palestine? 120 megawatts per day is delivered from Israel to Gaza. Pipes, so it's a desert. Remember, this area is a desert. They have to desalinate their water at their own cost, their own expense. Pipes about 10 to 13 million cubic meters of fresh water into Gaza. That's like, I have a poor neighbor, and it's my obligation. It's like you have a poor neighbor, right, that lives alongside of you, and the poor neighbor comes to you and says, like, "Hey, my electric bill is 130, my water bill is $4,000. Here's the bill. Go ahead. You pay for it." Israel has no need to do that. None of the Arab countries provide electricity to Gaza or the West Bank. None of the Arab countries give water or food aid. Actually, from Egypt into Gaza, they restrict the aid lines. Israel is not the only border to Palestine. Egypt has a border to Palestine. So if you can't get aid through Israel, why can't you get aid through Egypt? Egypt is restricting it just like Israel is because they know where the aid's going. It goes to Hamas, and they don't want it into Hamas because Hamas actually attacks Egypt because they're not happy with the fact that Egypt and Israel have peace. They're not happy with any country that has peace with Israel. And, to further push the point, why are we even talking about this topic of this war? You have genocides, you have wars happening all over the world. But why is Israel, this tiny little nation surrounded by huge countries, the center of debate, especially in Western civilization, where it's the only democracy? All these other nations are not democracies. They're dictatorships or ruled by royal families, and they have enormous amounts of wealth, natural resources that they're tapping into. Israel has to invent their resources. They have to invent their agriculture. And they're supporting pushing the frontier of human civilization forward, versus these other countries are not contributing at the same level that they should have. You can argue that, like, well, what are you going to do in 25 years? What are you going to do in 50 years to turn things around? How do you move an economy from 2007, where they were okay, to where it is today? Do you know the first flight of the Wright brothers were in the 1900s? By 1950, we were talking about putting humans on the moon with rocket ships. Think about what transpired in 50 years when you put your mind towards something to progress human evolution. And I know there's going to be a lot of naysayers, but the United States is literally the greatest country in the history of the world. We literally went from flying on kites, essentially, to sending people to the moon on rockets in 50 years. The evolution of humans have a capacity to do amazing and great things if they put their mind to it. But if you're fixated on hate, if you're fixated on the destruction of another group of people like Hamas is, you will not accomplish anything great. You will only bring more destruction. And that's the result of October 7th, post October 7th. That's the result of the hatred. You literally poked a bear, and the bear decided to come and attack your camp. Like, you can't cry about that. You made a conscious decision to go to war, and you chose to hide within your own people. It's a cowardly behavior, and I'm not condoning civilians being murdered, right? Like, my heart goes out to the Palestinian people and the children that are dying, and now generations are growing up around hate. This cycle has to break somewhere, right? It's like you grow up in a family where drunkenness is part of your culture, your family history, right? Where your dad was a drunk, his dad was a drunk, and his dad was a drunk. Does that mean you're going to be a drunk too? You have to make a conscious effort to break that cycle and say, like, no, I'm not going to go drink. I'm not even going to touch this stuff. I'm going to better my life. And I think until you see the Palestinian people rise up, kick Hamas out, this war will drag on. Because if I was Israel, I would not want Hamas at my border. I would not want Hamas as my next door neighbor.
Like, it is, so from a context of the recent history we are talking about, right? So we are focused on Hamas and Israel, and it's kind of baffling for us why they do what they do. Some of it is based on their ideology. They do enjoy broad support, honestly, in both Gaza and the West Bank, which is unfortunate, right? So somehow the cycle has to break, but also think of it as the propaganda they give is the only news they hear. So I think a good parallel could be if you're a Republican and you're constantly listening to one news network, I don't know, Fox News, and you're a Democrat, you're only listening to MSNBC or whatever other left-leaning networks they are, you just get more and more embedded in your beliefs, and you're unable to break the cycle. And now average that across the entire population, right? And think of like, if all the education and all the texts and all the newspapers and everything is based on what they read and what they understand, how do you break out of it? You're assuming they have access to all information and that they can study, right? So this is why I'm sympathetic to the cause. That we need to, I'm not saying that they are not wrong. What I'm saying is like just pointing the finger and saying that they are wrong doesn't solve our problem, because this problem has been ongoing for so long.
Yeah, 100%. I think as a believer, we have to see that there is good and evil in the world, but also that Palestinians are made in the image of God. Jesus Christ died for them, right? And we have to look and ask ourselves hard questions, as you alluded to, Biju. Why is there such a culture of hate? One, I think it goes back to, as you alluded to, the indoctrination that they've been receiving since they were kids. Generations upon generations upon generations of kids are taught to hate. And that, I think, is one of the core issues that will sadly propagate the hate if it's not dealt with. And we talked about this over the weekend, but after World War II, there was a vast amount of anti-Semitism in Germany, right? It wasn't just Hitler that wanted to kill the Jews. It was a very culture. There was steps taken by the Allied powers to introduce cultural education, values of tolerance, and essentially empathy into their curriculum. And you look at Germany today, look at Berlin. I saw yesterday on October 7th, they had a huge Jewish flag hanging in Berlin to essentially mourn with the Jews and stand with them. 70 years ago, it was this seat of the Holocaust. But that's what the power of changing and these systems of indoctrination work. And so, I agree with you. I think we need to take a hard look and ask ourselves, how can we reposition the conversation from they're horrible to why are they taught hate and why is such a culture prevalent in their society? So
Exactly.
moving on to the next question. Oh, sorry, go ahead. I'll let you respond.
No, you're absolutely correct. And this is applicable to so many different things. That the German example is a great example. We've had like you can see a lot of different comparisons across the world, right? You can see how Pakistan developed from 1947 to now, and you can see India's trajectory from 1947 to now. It's a good case study to see how nations change, but also understand that some of it is generational change. So if you're looking for something to come up in the next 5 years, it's not happening. But you will see the results and the fruits of the labor that you put in, the investments you put in 20, 30, 40, 50 years down the road. That's the way the peace should be thought of.
100% agree. I think it begins with the kids, and the fruit of that will happen. Moving on a slight tangent, what is the pathway to peace? Last week, President Donald Trump presented a workable peace plan, a 20-point peace plan to talk about Trump's foreign relations record in the Middle East. He successfully orchestrated the Abraham Accords. Key proposals of this 20-point peace plan, I'm not going to read it all now, I'll just quickly summarize it. Immediate ceasefire, hostage and prisoner exchange, demilitarization, transitional governments, reconstruction and economic development, aid delivery, international stabilization force, IDF withdrawal, conditional path to statehood. A lot of interesting points there that we can deep dive in. But what are your thoughts on this 20-point peace plan? Do you think it's feasible to actually achieving peace?
Yes. So long-lasting peace, right? Some of the points that you mentioned in the 20 points, the plan that President Trump put forward, they're definitely components. They're known components of peace plans. So, but just that we were talking so far, right? We heard President Bill Clinton. We heard the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton talking. Like, if it were easy, it would have already been achieved. So there is some ingredient missing. And I know President Clinton talked about they don't want it, but that's a little hard to digest, that somebody does not want peace. And it's a kind of terrible premise to go off of, because if that's your premise, you're not going to peace. So you want to start off with like a stepwise solution that is shown in the 20-point plan. But to achieve anything that is meaningful entails certain components. There has to be forgiveness for past hurts. There has to be a compromise of ideologies. There have to be reasonable level of trust being built. Because if you always suspect each other, you're not going anywhere. It doesn't matter if it's a marriage or a company or whatever. Life is built on trust. I trust that the chair I'm sitting still holds, else I'll be on the floor, right? It's simple things of trust. And I think the plan that they have has a lot of good components. I think also the immediate ceasefire, release of hostages, truth frameworks. It's very important to also have mechanisms where these things are going to be breached. It's going to happen. Something or the other is going to happen. Some extreme elements are going to cause problems. So what is your framework of de-escalation so that an issue doesn't spin out of control? That's important. Like I said, investing in trust building measures are important. 8 packages they talked about, that's perfect. I think one of the big things that we're missing in that plan, based on just what our discussion so far, is how do we get a cultural education going, right? And this is very prominent in the Middle East. So if you look at places like Qatar and Kuwait, places that I'm aware of, like Bahrain, like they have a lot of programs where they exchange students. A lot of young kids come to the US. They come to the United Kingdom. There's a lot of exchange programs happening, free of cost from the government perspective. I mean, it's pretty amazing. Like they can come and study for free, and their government sponsors the entire thing, plus they're living in accommodation and a stipend. So it's amazing. But if you think about it, and now you go to these places like the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, you can see, fast forwarding 20 years, 30 years, these young people who studied and got perspective from different cultures and different people now run their country in a different way. They operate differently. So we do need to think about some of that, right? Because if they're always constantly under the umbrella of Hamas and what they are propagating, and I'm not blaming the people themselves, right? Because you have to give them avenues to the rest of the world. And that's why we draw the parallel of people who consciously just only listen to far right news or far left news in the US. Same problem. They are in their bubble and they won't even listen to you. You cannot have a meaningful conversation. It's very similar in my mind, at least. So how do you break people out of that? And that's something I think we need to figure out like if you want to utilize these aid packages that people, the international community is pouring into Gaza, that's probably a really good way to spend money.
Yeah, excellent point. And one thing for listeners that may not know, you were born and raised in the Middle East, so you have a very thorough understanding of the culture there. And so I think that's important for listeners to understand and know. But regarding the 20-point peace plan, my thoughts from a 20,000-foot perspective here, at a high level, I've read through each paragraph of this in detail. I think it's a fair, well-accepted, workable plan. I'm not a foreign policy expert, but I've listened to others to hear enough. Here's why. You have many nations actually behind this plan, more so than any other peace plan in this war. You obviously have Israel and the US. You actually have Qatar on board. Now, Qatar is interesting. Qatar has played both sides of the deal. The power and funding from Hamas is from Qatar, but they're also at the table behind this deal. So they've essentially switched sides here. In fact, on October 8th, 2023, Qatar could have called Hamas and forced them to give up hostages. Qatar is not backing down from supporting Hamas. In fact, Qatar has never condemned October 7th to this day, but they're actually backing this deal now. So you have nations behind this deal. You have the US, you have Qatar, you have Jordan, UAE, Indonesia, Pakistan, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, France, Germany, Italy, Spain. Now, guess who hasn't accepted this deal? Hamas. Hamas has still not accepted this deal yet, partly because they've relied in the past on the PR of having Qatar or some of the European countries or Middle Eastern countries on their side. Now it doesn't, so there's certainly pressure for them to accept this deal. But at a high level, it's fair. You have a large group of nations behind it. It's workable. I'm hoping that it is signed and we'll have an end to this war. Now, digging deeper into the 20-point peace plan, I wanted to just go through some of the details just really quickly. There's 20 points here. Very interesting. Some of the points are worth mentioning and talking through and thinking about. Encourage everyone listening, go and read the 20-point peace plan. Not a hard read. Gaza, number 1, will be a de-radicalized terror-free zone that does not pose a threat to its neighbors. This is vastly different from the Hamas charter. Point 3 says that the war will end immediately. Israeli forces will withdraw to the agreed upon line. And so there is a map where they're going to withdraw to. Within 72 hours, Israel publicly accepting this agreement. all hostages alive and deceased will be returned. Now, Hamas has a history of dragging things out, so they added 72 hours in there as a clause from when this deal is accepted. Once all hostages are released, Israel released 250 life sentence prisoners, 1,700 Gazans, including all women and children, really teenagers. For every Israeli hostage whose remains are released, Israel will release the remains of 15 deceased Gazans. I don't understand the math there, but that's what's in the deal. 1 to 15. I don't get why it's 1 to 15. It should be 1 to 1, in my opinion. The sixth point they make, Hamas will actually be given amnesty. Members of Hamas who wish to leave Gaza will be provided safe passage to receiving countries. So that's interesting. It's not like they're not going to gather them up and like execute them. They're giving them a clear path to leave and move to another country. Upon acceptance of this agreement, fund aid will immediately be sent to the Gaza Strip. At a minimum, aid quantities will be consistent with what was determined in January 2025. Now, it's interesting. Here's where my light bulb goes off, and I'm a little scared about the distribution of this aid will pass through the UN and its agencies and the Red Crescent. Now, my understanding in the past, I'm not sure about the reliability of relying on the UN for the distribution of humanitarian assistance in this region, given that we know that many people who were part of this terror network were funded by UN payroll. So, we do have evidence that members of Hamas were being funded indirectly through UNRWA, and money was obviously being funneled to them. So my thinking hat goes on there. I think we need some more oversight there. Another interesting point 9 in that 20-point peace plan, a temporary transitional governance. So there's going to be a temporary government set up. Really fascinating there. You're not going to have, Hamas taking over or another Middle Eastern country. It's going to be a political Palestinian committee. The committee will be made up of qualified Palestinians, national experts, with oversight and supervision by a new international transitional body called the Board of Peace, headed and chaired by Donald Trump. I thought that was funny, right? Like the Board of Peace sounds like something Trump made up at the White House. I don't know, it just sounds like something he made up. Now, what's interesting here, and this is a little controversial, I think Israel made a huge concession on this next point. The body will set the framework and handle the funding for the redevelopment of Gaza until such a time as the Palestinian Authority has completed its reform program and takes over. So essentially what they're saying is after this transitional government is in place and institutes all their reforms, they're calling on the Palestinian Authority, right, which is currently administering the West Bank, to take over. Now, the Palestinian Authority is widely known to be corrupt. This is a major concession that Israel made. I thought that was really interesting. I don't know how that will play out. So something to note in the plan. Regarding the economic plan and the economic development, the Trump economic development plan to rebuild and re-energize Gaza will be created by a panel of experts who have birthed some of the thriving modern miracle cities in the Middle East. Here's where I imagine like a Trump Tower going into Gaza. I don't think that'll happen, but it sure sounds like someone on his staff wrote this. Special economic zone will be established with preferred tariff and access rates. Gaza developed. It's a beautiful, could be a multi-billion-dollar tourist economy. Sits along the Mediterranean coast. Absolutely beautiful. Article 15, Hamas and other factions agree not to have any role in the governance of Gaza. That is a good thing. We do not want Hamas there. You read their charter. We do not want their charter there. The demilitarization of Gaza under the supervision of independent monitors. That's important. We're not just trusting Hamas to demilitarize, right? International monitors are there. Regional partners, clause 16, will ensure that Hamas and factions comply with their obligations. The next clause, number 17, really interesting. The IDF will gradually hand over control to something called the ISF, International Stabilization Force, to immediately deploy in Gaza. So it's not like the IDF just pulls out and there's a vacuum, right? There's going to be an ISF supported by Jordan and Egypt, who have extensive experience in this field. What's also interesting, a deconfliction mechanism will be agreed upon by the parties. So there's going to be some type of mechanism in place where they institute a way to de-escalate major problems. The next clause says that the ISF establishes control and stability. The IDF will gradually withdraw here. Interesting, in that clause 19, they mentioned if Hamas delays or rejects this proposal, the IDF will still continue transfer to the ISF. So that's interesting. I think they kind of expected Hamas to do something there. The next clause is fascinating. An interfaith dialogue process will be established based upon the values of tolerance and peaceful coexistence to try and change mindsets and narratives of Palestinians and Israelis by emphasizing the benefits that can be derived from peace. I think that's awesome. We just talked about that. We need to change the mindset of the people there from thinking about hate and terror to peace and coexistence. Finally, and this is interesting, right? I'll read this out verbatim. While Gaza redevelopment advances and when the Palestinian reform program is faithfully carried out, the conditions may finally be in place for a credible pathway to Palestinian self-determination and statehood, which we recognize as the aspiration of the Palestinian people. Here's what they're saying. We're not going to give you statehood at the beginning of this. Like when you sign the deal, you're not getting statehood, right? That's what a lot of people wanted. What they're saying is this: if gigantic changes can happen on the ground, if the Palestinian Authority becomes moderate, all the reforms are successful, then maybe, just maybe, we might be able to think about statehood. They're not saying that a statehood is a prerequisite. They're saying it's a possibility if we can have great changes on the ground. So reading through this, I think there's a lot of concessions here being made on a lot of sides. I don't think Israel's happy about handing authority to the Palestinian Authority there, let alone having Middle Eastern countries now, run Gaza. It sounds like a great, peaceable, workable plan, in my opinion. So
Yeah,
I'll
no,
let you comment, Teju, if you
100%.
have any thoughts.
No,
Yeah.
100% agree, right? And that's a key, right? Is that this does not necessarily look like, oh, here's a Israeli peace plan backed by Donald Trump. This looks like
Right.
somebody independent. I'm guessing Jared Kushner and others were very, very heavily involved in designing a plan that actually works. And it includes compromise from both parties. High level looks good, strong, robust, but the execution, the details, that's important. I think Trump did one of the good things that he's done is he's definitely created allies in the Middle East. That's a big boost for where we are. So if that had not happened, like if the Abraham Accords had not happened in his first term, we would have been a little more farther away from peace than we are today.
Excellent point. Yeah. This really builds on the backbone of those relationships that were established years ago. So yeah, this is the 20-point peace plan. I mean, we can look and read and smile and hope the war comes to an end. I think we all want war to come to an end. We do pray for peace for the Palestinian people, comfort and peace for those in Israel who lost so many people on October 7th, and just, a regional war that's been going on for decades. So we hope this is a good step in the right direction. So with that said, Biju, I want to thank you so much for joining. I know Tijo had to leave a few minutes early, but again, if you're listening, encourage you guys to like and subscribe to our podcast, The Balanced Lens, where we talk about faith, culture, and politics from a Christian worldview, hopefully from a balanced perspective where we look at both sides and ask ourselves what is really right and what is really true in the situations. Thank you guys and hope to have you guys back in the next episode. Bye now.